Hi guys, welcome to Novum and welcome to the complete companion guide to the Green Knight. It's taken me a little bit longer to get this video out, mainly because of COVID delaying the release in my country, but also because there's a lot to talk about here. I've seen a lot of third-party media sites getting a lot of stuff wrong in their breakdowns or just leaving a lot of stuff unexplained. Now there's a lot of stuff that's deliberately ambiguous, which we're going to go through, but after this video is done, hopefully there won't be anything unexplained. If you haven't seen one of my complete guide videos before, they aim to be extremely comprehensive, and this is no exception. I've got a lot of really cool stuff to go through that I haven't seen anywhere else, and as well as that, we're really going to burrow down into the overall meaning and how it's similar to the original story, where it stands apart, and what that changes. We're going to be weaving a lot of stuff together, so hopefully wherever you are in your knowledge of classical literature, British history, and Arthurian myth, there's still going to be a lot you'll get out of this video. Even though we're going to be dipping into the original story frequently, this video will be working under the presumption that you're already aware of the events in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and if you need a quick refresher on that, you can find a full breakdown in my trailer video. The link for that should be on the top of the screen right now. If you're looking for a specific answer about one thing, just have a look through the chapter titles and you should find what you're looking for. Alright, let's get started. This is part 1, Foundations. So to start out, we get this creepy opening poem as we see Gawain dressed up with the garb and positioning of a Christian king or some other holy figure in medieval Christian art. We see the beautifully designed crown lowering onto his head, again heavily reminiscent of halos in medieval Christian artwork. I don't know about you, but I always like the narrator to have an explanation as to who they are. I'm not certain as both roles are uncredited, but according to people on Reddit who attended Q&A screenings, the director David Lowery provided a voice cameo for the talking fox, and when you play them side by side, this narrator has pretty much the exact same voice as the fox, and it's also an uncredited role, so I think it's pretty safe to say that this is David Lowery as well. We'll look at exactly who that is in the context of the film later on when we get to the fox. As the poem continues, we see Gawain's head set on fire, and we have the obvious foreshadowing of the threat to Gawain's head, but also the connotation that greatness, this royal scene we see him part of, could be his downfall. The first half of the poem is concerned with pointing out that Gawain is not the figure of greatness that Arthur is. He's not the boy who pulled sword from stone, which fits with the notion that this scene is essentially foreshadowing that Gawain rising to power would be a very bad thing, something we see confirmed later on, and also that Gawain isn't going to be the heroic character you may traditionally recognize him as. The second half of the poem focuses on specifically the telling of Gawain's story, literally every line of it. Let me tell you instead a new tale, I'll lay it down as I've heard it told. It's all hyper concerned with the telling and retelling and even constructions of stories, with its letters sent, its history pressed, referencing early forms of written communication, typesetting, and calligraphy. We also see an effort to position this alongside other great myths with like all great myths of old, which brings us very neatly to the first real scene of the movie and Helen and Paris. A lot of people were confused, myself included, when the first two credited cast members appeared online as Helen and Paris, the ill-fated lovers from the Iliad. I'm sure a great many more were confused when the titles rolled and they appeared right at the front. We don't get much screen time with them, but the opening shot of the movie shows a man and a woman fleeing some sort of dangerous scenario with a building burning in the background. The woman gets on the horse and the man draws his sword, presumably getting ready to fend someone off. Now, in terms of how this affects the movie, it's foreshadowing of how Gawain's lust will be his undoing. Will he be another hero of fable that falls because of a woman and so on? And it's also speaking to all the parallels between Arthurian and Homeric myth, the great mythical cities of Camelot and Troy, both being brought down, in part at least, through the infidelity of queens. The similarities go on, and it's not a coincidence. In fact, the opening and closing lines of the original Gawain poem both reference Troy. This was a very common trope at the time in British medieval literature. British scholars were aware of Homeric myth and saw the ancient Roman and Greek empires as being culturally, classically advanced and essentially the birthplace of European culture. They were extremely keen to align British mythology and the British kingdom with these great empires as a suggestion that it was the next in line in that lineage of greatness. For example, Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-historical account, The History of the Kings of Britain, begins with the Trojans founding the British nation and continuing to reign there in some format until the Anglo-Saxons assumed control around the 7th century. It's essentially an effort to trace this great classical lineage back behind Arthur and give their work legitimacy. The Gawain poem wants you to consider it as another take on these great heroic tales that follow great empires and often long outlast them, and the film wants to remind you of the same thing, that this is a retelling of a retelling. Its opening shot calls back immediately to the first line of the poem it's based on, which in turn calls back to the earliest classical tales of heroism, honor, and virtue among warriors. And that is going to be a huge theme as we move through here. This film is extremely aware of its place in the Gawain canon, and sometimes it feels extremely modern and different, and at other times it seems very traditional and rigid. But as abstract as it may seem at points, this movie always knows what it's doing and why, and we'll look at how it balances that out as we move through, because it can get pretty meta. Panning down from Helen Paris, we see evidence of Gawain's late night in the brothel via the excess of spilled candle wax and his apparent hangover. We see Essel throw a bucket of water over Gawain and utter the first spoken line of dialogue in the film, "Christ is born." Now firstly, that's the film's way of letting us know it's Christmas, but it's also the first of many parallels between Gawain and Christ. The original poem is set on New Year's Eve, so it's a purposeful choice to move it to Christmas, and that's to strengthen the parallel between Gawain and Christ. Christ is born at Christmas, and Gawain is born once in legend on the first Christmas as he becomes the man that beheads the Green Knight, and born once again the next Christmas at the end of the movie as an honest man and a good knight. However, thankfully, the subtext here isn't as simple as Gawain is Jesus lol, it goes a lot deeper than that. He's obviously making fun of the notion with his reply, "Christ is born, indeed," and grabbing of Essel, so also the second time in as many minutes that the film has opposed Gawain as being this great holy figure. For now though, the film definitely wants you to notice the parallels between the two more than the differences. For instance, he's hanging out with a prostitute, the baptismal connotations of water, and so on. As we move through the brothel, we see that Gawain clearly spends a lot of time here due to his familiarity with the staff. We see he is paying Essel for her services from his tossing the coin at her, and we get told directly that he isn't a knight yet when one of the passing workers asks him. He replies not yet, and that he has time, which is obvious foreshadowing for the tight deadline about to be applied to his mortality. And in semi-reply to this, but hidden as him complaining to Essel about the early rise for church, he says, "I'm not ready yet," which is essentially the best description of this version of Gawain. He is not the beacon of honor and virtue we usually understand him to be. He is still a selfish child, burdened with desire and hot-headedness. He is not ready to become a knight. This is called back to in Gawain's final line of the film, "I'm ready," once he has finally understood the power of honesty and virtue. As the scene moves forward, we get some scrambled titling, referring to the film as a filmed adaptation of the chivalric romance by Anonymous, which is kind of purposefully wordy and drawing attention again to this film's position as the latest in line in a series of retellings and the generally nebulous and ever-changing nature of a story we can't even place to an original named author. We see this too in how the film cycles through fonts for its titles, using different calligraphic styles to represent the same title. These are not only identifiable as different cultures such as monastic calligraphy and then font work traditionally recognized as Celtic, they're actually directly reminiscent of some of the famous Gawain and the Green Knight manuscripts. And again, it's all designed to demonstrate that retelling Gawain's story has been going on for centuries and that this is simply the latest in line and very aware of the stories that have come before it. It's half having fun with that fact, half reassuring the viewer that it knows what it's doing. We see Gawain riding out towards church and see another strong hint at his lack of virtue in his riding past the freezing cold Essel without offering her his hand. When he does, he jokingly removes it, and when he does finally let her up, he doesn't dismount and guide the horse as would be the proper behavior in a chivalric romance. During this scene, we get bombarded with bells. Essel's clothing has bells sewn into it, and the church bells are ringing to signal the start of Christmas service. In both cases, they're designed to signal the same thing, the Christian faith. Essel may be a prostitute, but she is still clearly devout in her belief of God. She is attending mass, she wears bells, she is in some ways at least a sort of Mary Magdalene figure for Gawain. But most importantly, she represents virtue. She loves Gawain, she wants to be his lady, she wants an honest monogamous relationship not based around money. She represents Christian and chivalric traditions of honouring the woman you've promised yourself to, the Christian world that Gawain is pulled further away from as he falls into the world of pagan sexual desire and selfish gratification. That's why she gives Gawain a bell as a token to remember her, not just to remind him of their bond, but also the moral understanding they have to be honest to each other under God, something she is a lot more certain of than Gawain. When Gawain gets home to his mother, we see further evidence of this in his jokingly referring to the brothel as mass, with the likelihood of him never actually attending the church with Essel given that we don't see it. Gawain makes straight for his bed, and again we see he's lazy and selfish in his desires. Gawain's mother tells him she isn't attending the feast, and it becomes clear very quickly that she's planning on summoning the Green Knight. Now, the question of who is Gawain's mother is a very important one. The film is deliberately stark with its character names. Arthur is simply king, and Guinevere is simply queen. Merlin is just magician. But it's also clear as to who those characters are because they're still fulfilling the same role as they do in the original, and really there's no alternative for who they could be. Gawain's mother, on the other hand, doesn't appear at all in the original Gawain poem, save for a single passing mention where she's just referred to as mother. Traditionally though, and most importantly in La Morte d'Arthur, which is the closest thing we have to Arthurian canon, Gawain's mother is Morgause, the younger sister of Morgana and Alfred's half-sister. Just like Morgana, she is a powerful witch, and as well as Gawain, she also gives birth to Mordred via an act of incest with Arthur. Morgana Le Fay, on the other hand, is very much much present in the original Gawain poem, and it's predominantly her role that is played out by Gawain's mother here. So really, the neatest answer is that she's a mashup of Morgana and Morgause, and again, the film is knowingly playing with the convoluted nature of Arthurian myth. The director David Lowery said in interviews that it essentially is a mashup of both characters, which deliberately keeps it vague, but they do refer to her as Morgana in those interviews, and I think that is just because she is the more popular and well-known character. But for me, I think it makes a lot more sense that this character is Morgause, and the reason being that there's never been a precedent for Morgana being Gawain's mother, but there's plenty of precedent for Morgause doing screwy magic in Arthur's court for the benefit of her children. And the motivations of the character change due to the nature of her relationship with Gawain. In the original, Morgana seeks to undermine Arthur's rule and prove that chivalry is an illusion by presenting a test that even the bravest knight would fail. That's what she wants to do, and she essentially achieves it. But here it's quite different, specifically because it's Gawain's mother pulling the strings. She gives him the sash to save him, not to spite him. Morgana has the knight call out Arthur in the slight hope she may be able to strike the king down. Here it seems like Gawain's mother can clearly tell that Arthur is in no state to duel, and she's eager for her son to attend the festivities. So as we'll see, she clearly has a lot more planned for Gawain. And so if her relationship to the characters is essentially just Morgause's, and her motivations throughout the narrative are essentially just Morgause's, then for me, the character is just Morgause. Yes, she's being pushed into something reminiscent of Morgana's role, but in every meaningful sense, she is Morgause. Really, other than Gawain's more immature state of being, it's this choice to switch Morgana to Morgause that affects most of the differences in the narrative between this film and the original. One final reason why I think it's Morgause rather than Morgana is that Morgause as a character is often overlooked in favour of her more popular sister Morgana, and as we'll see, this film is obsessed with subverting the traditional roles of women in medieval literature and giving voice to the unsung women of Arthurian myth. Having the lesser-known Morgause take over for her sister seems very fitting in this regard. It's also worth mentioning that I don't think she's necessarily working against Arthur, and we'll look at that in detail as it crops up, along with what it is that Morgause actually wants out of all this. With that out of the way, let's move on to the Banquet and the Beheading Game as we start seeing her plan unfold. There's a shared look between Arthur and Guinevere here that could either be them simply recognizing that they need to be better acquainted with Gawain, or perhaps that they have some awareness of what's about to transpire. Arthur and Gawain make reference to the empty chair on Arthur's right side. Now, as with Gawain's mother being Morgana and a lot of other things we'll cover, I've seen a lot of outlets just getting this wrong and suggesting this chair belongs to Mordred. I do not think this is the case. Very simple reason for this. Mordred is Gawain's brother or half-brother. He would definitely know if his mother had another child, and when discussing the empty seat, it seems odd that Arthur wouldn't make reference of Gawain's brother. It's possible that Gawain just isn't aware of his brother because he is still hidden away from his childhood assassination attempt, but then he would never have had the seat to begin with. We also see no evidence of the incestual relationship between Arthur and Morgause here, and moreover, Mordred was Arthur's illegitimate incest baby, not his right-hand man, although he was a Knight of the Round Table for a while. I'm pretty certain this dialogue is meant to explain the absence of Lancelot from the film and provide a soft allusion to his infidelity with Guinevere. This makes sense as Camelot, Arthur, and Guinevere are all in a sort of aging or decaying later point in their arcs, and it gives more weight to the Paris and Helen metaphor from the start, given that Lancelot and Guinevere fit very closely with that narrative. Also, following Lancelot's betrayal and 2-month campaign against Arthur, he does spend a significant period of time away from Camelot and doesn't return until 5 years after Arthur's death. When Mordred leaves Camelot, it's not in the sense that he may one day reclaim his seat at the table, it's more that he'll be coming back to conquer it. There is one more thing worth mentioning here. There is a seat at the Round Table, often positioned to the right of Arthur, that actually has its own name and special role. It is referred to as the Siege Perilous and is reserved for only the bravest of knights and would actually kill anyone else that dare sit in it. Long before Le Morte d'Arthur, it was Percival that fulfilled this role, but as Christianity and Arthurian myth became further intertwined in what's known as the Lancelot Grail cycle, this seat was reserved for the knight who would find the Holy Grail, namely Sir Galahad, son of Lancelot. In fact, in some stories, it's Lancelot that sits in the chair prior to his betrayal and Galahad's later claim to it. And Galahad is indefinitely absent from Camelot too following his quest to find the Grail, with people rightfully skeptical of his return given that he descended to heaven. Now, this chair doesn't kill Gawain, and it isn't referred to as the Siege Perilous, but it does seem like a knowing nod to the wider mythos even if it isn't dwelled upon. So, very likely, chair belongs to Lancelot, very not likely Mordred, and maybe Galahad at a push, but if it was, then I doubt Gawain would even be allowed to sit in it, because it's only ever Galahad once the chair itself has foretold told that he will recover the Grail, and at which point no one else would be sitting in it. There's a charming piece of dialogue where Arthur refers to Gawain as having been quiffed from his mother's womb, and yes, that does mean what you think it means. While that word doesn't quite appear in La Morte d'Arthur, there's plenty of language very similar to that. In fact, the film does a great job, especially with Arthur, of striking a balance between the language of the original text and something more cleanly understandable for modern audiences. It's not quite authentic, but it's cinematically pleasing, and I think that's what's most important. One place they do stick to authenticity, though, is Gawain's name, which is rightfully pronounced with the harder vowel sounds of Old English as Garwin. It's also pronounced more like Gawain and Gawain by other characters, again to resemble this fluidity of the character between interpretations and just different regional dialects. That being said, unlike The Witch, they don't stick to this tone throughout. It's purposefully done with the name Garwin to remind us that we're seeing the man before the legend, that Gawain is a modern understanding, a myth built piece by piece. The Garwin we see here isn't that man yet, just like he doesn't have his knighthood yet. It's not Sir Gawain, it's just Garwin. It's drawing your attention to the more flawed and naive portrayal of Gawain, as well as reminding you of how the character has evolved since this story was first told. Arthur seeks to better know Gawain and explains that he feels distant from him. The purpose of the conversation is quite clear. Arthur knows his men through deeds, through acts, where they display the kind of men they are. This version of Gawain is not an already established knight. He has shied away from duty and responsibility, and he has no tales to tell, no great deeds of valor to his name. And this is extremely fortuitous timing for this conversation, given that opportunity for legendary fame is about to come walking through the door. Beyond the king calling Gawain up to have a little one-to-one, and Morgause being the spellcaster, this scene pretty much plays out exactly as it does traditionally. And it's edited in such a way that Morgause almost waits for their conversation to play out before beginning her ritual. The moment their conversation ends, we cut to her donning the blindfold that identifies her as the Morgana role, and the scene at the banquet begins taking place essentially as it does in the original poem. It's like she's almost aware of the story and how it should take place, just as we see with her writing out the Green Knight's speech before he says it. It's minor, but it's another building block to this film playing with the idea of adaptation and retelling. And there are some differences in what the knight says that are worth pointing out because they can help us decipher the differences between Morgana's traditional motivations and the motivations of Gawain's mum. So traditionally, the Green Knight is far more boastful and perhaps a little more confrontational. He speaks of how none of Arthur's knights or even Arthur himself could hope to best him in regular combat, and uses their pride to manipulate them, going as far as to mock their cowardice for not wanting to compete. He also makes it a lot clearer that he will withstand the blow as part of his more boastful attitude. I think it would also have been a lot clearer to original contemporary audiences that a beheading was on the table, because this is a recognized trope in medieval literature known as the Beheading Game, the rules of which are pretty much the same as they are put forward in the Gawain poem. You behead me, then I behead you if I can, either now or at a later date. And I think this sounds a little silly to modern ears given the general finality of beheading, but at the time this was far more readily accepted, and not just via magic, often via trickery or skill in combat, or sometimes just by having a very strong neck, I guess. The rules never really played out exactly the same, there's always a trick to it. In the film though, because this isn't Morgana pulling the strings and the intention isn't necessarily to undermine Arthur's rule and the concept of chivalry, we instead see the Green Knight presenting a more diplomatically put across wager that allows for the possibility of a nick or small strike across the cheek that would have non-lethal repercussions for Gawain. This subtly positions Gawain's beheading decision as much more of a failure of honor than it is in the text. He hasn't just been confronted by a being that insists it can withstand being beheaded that's mocked all of his peers, he just sees an opportunity to make a name for himself and acts rashly and selfishly, to make stories that will be told about him as he and Arthur desire. The Green Knight is offering fair exchange and a test of honor, and Gawain ostensibly executes him in one blow because this is a Gawain that does not yet possess the honor and virtue he is famed for. The Green Knight also doesn't extend the challenge to Arthur in the film, referring to his knights and suggesting the participant would be a champion of Arthur's rather than Arthur himself. And again, this is a version of Morgause or Morgana that understands perfectly that Arthur won't be able to compete in single combat when he can barely lift his sword. And when you consider that in conjunction with Arthur's concerned look to Guinevere and his fortuitously timed conversation about Gawain's need for great stories, I think there's a hint that maybe Arthur has signed off on Morgause's plan for Gawain. Nothing concrete, but something to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, we get our first look at magic being performed here too. The film sort of blends medieval paganistic witchcraft and modern day Wiccan influences to create this magic that is very much earth and nature focused. One important note is the circular green seal that closes the pact, again a reference to nature, but also the lunar cycle, as we see in the trailer. This was imagery that was very closely linked with the seasons and influence over the natural world, and this is all very important setup and subtext in the original narrative, that there's this deeper, more subtle background war going on between Christianity and progress, and paganism and the natural. And by far the biggest icon of that in the story is the Knight of the Green Chapel himself, who is broadly representative of the Green Man, the sort of Celtic and Gaelic embodiment of the natural world and its magical power. Everything from Ents to magical druids seem to take influence from him in some way or another, predominantly because he's such an early symbol in British mythology. As you may imagine with any millennia-old spiritual symbol, he represents a great many things, but most crucially, beyond the natural realm in general, he represents fertility and life and death and the natural cycle. The green, as Alicia Vikander's lady will later describe it, whether that's leaves or a newborn baby. The spell to summon the Green Knight results in a flower sprouting rapidly. When he puts his axe against the stone floor of the castle, green life begins to spring up from the cracks. And not just green, but also the red of blood and what looks to be white, presumably because of lighting or the white dust wash on the stone mixing with the blood. But fans of this channel will know I have a big thing about red and white in cinema and literature. You can go check out my Alien Explained video for an in-depth explainer on that, but it's essentially shorthand for the fluids of life and the messy necessities of the natural cycle, and this film is no exception. The two other fluid or notable colours here that this film will focus on alongside green are red and white, and it's for exactly this reason. The lady even makes reference to this when she says the red of lust gives way to the green of new life. And we see all of these ideas of the natural world and the cycle of life juxtaposed with this version of Camelot. Everything is dull and lifeless and bleak, extended beyond its time and sickly almost. It's ill like its king, or barren like its queen. The kingdom has been united under one banner, but all of this supposed progress has led to a land littered with death and stripped bare of its resources. The total destruction of the natural. Like we see in Gawain's character here, the world of man is propelled with selfish desire and needs to find a balance with the nature that surrounds it. And in line with this, the holly bow that the Green Knight carries was a traditional symbol for peace, kind of how we understand the white flag of surrender or parley, and it's interesting that the Green Knight carries both this and a giant axe. Again, there are competing ideals between peaceful naturalism and the violent invention and progress and warfare of Dark Ages and early medieval England. Gawain choosing the axe is indicative of man only seeking to destroy nature. Gawain and Arthur both say a couple of things of note before the beheading occurs. Arthur tells Gawain to remember 'tis only a game, which can be interpreted as him warning Gawain to take it easy and not strike a killing blow, or alternatively him telling him ultimately not to worry because this is a test of character and he won't be harmed, both of which suggest Arthur has prior knowledge, but this could of course just be kingly intuition. It's also a playful reference to the Beheading Game, as we've discussed, and could be Arthur's way of saying don't mess up the decapitation that's about to occur or you're getting it back. Ultimately, I think in narrative this warning should be read as it is in the poem, that Arthur senses trickery is afoot and warns Gawain to erring on the side of caution, which goes unheeded. But he could be a step more knowing and trying his best to push Gawain to the more honourable, less murderous choice. On a meta level though, is the film talking to us, as it does several times, telling us not to worry or concern ourselves with tracking a lineal or realistic narrative from this point out, and instead to have fun in the telling of it. Gawain steps up to the beheading plate and he shows a great deal of discomfort at the Green Knight's willingness to be decapitated. He repeats the process of what's just happened out loud, realizing he's bound to his word but unable to see an alternate route forward. And as he strikes the blow against the yielding enemy, he screams, "Never forget what happened here this day." He is concerned with fame and notoriety and making a name for himself, rather than the act of essentially murder that he's committing here. The floor's brickwork has the Pentangle symbol of the chivalric covenant built into it, and we see the blood of Gawain's victim pour over it in visual allegory for the sullying of virtue. It's expectation and pride driving Gawain here. He doesn't need to kill him, but he so desperately wants to be the hero that he charges forward with it anyway. He hasn't learnt the courage of humility, or the right times for a man to engage in combat, or any of the chivalric values we recognise the character for. As a quick side note, I love the quiet esteem and hint of magic they give to Excalibur without ever naming it. I love Sean Harris's unease at someone else holding it, and how his decision to give it to Gawain encapsulates his goodwill towards the character. I think it exemplifies this film's treatment of Arthurian myth, reverent and restrained, subtle and self-contained, but still not being afraid of putting the big stuff up on screen. We see Arthur throw a quick look to Merlin, who shakes his head as if to say it's not human magic or witchcraft that he recognizes, perhaps suggesting he senses the work of something more powerful and primordial. Now, whatever Arthur's involvement has been up until this point, if any, I think his reaction following the beheading says everything we need to know. This had been a test of Gawain Gawain's knightly ethics, and he has very much failed as far as Arthur is concerned. Arthur either is aware of the trials that will follow, or he's just astute enough to sense the trouble that Gawain is now in. Either way, it's certainly putting emphasis on Gawain having more agency than he does in traditional tellings. Also, Arthur and Gawain are usually slightly concerned that it may be more than a game, but not this look of total dread that we see here. Morgause is trickier to read. Her expressions are slight, and I do mean slight. Her intentions and motivations are kept purposefully vague, and subsequently she's a stone wall for a lot of this. But we definitely see initial shock, presumably just because she's been beheaded in Wickham VR. Following that, I think there's a definite feeling of, oh shit, Gawain didn't act how we thought he would. Followed by a flicker of intrigue, and perhaps the beginnings of a smirk. Not a smirk of satisfaction though, and so there's two things we can really glean from this. She isn't pulling this stunt out of malice, and like Arthur, there is an element of concern over what comes next. Unlike Arthur though, I think this is very much an eventuality she planned for, and rather than dread, she watches with interest. Perhaps she's even a little proud of her son for acting so recklessly despite the danger he's invited upon himself. So that's the basic introduction to the themes that are present in the film and what's going on in relation to the original story, but let's move on and see what it actually does with all that. So we skip forward a year following the beheading and see this represented in the spin wheel background of a children's puppet show. Despite representing the whole yearly cycle, the trees are bare in almost every season, with a few leaves in summer. Now, this is almost certainly another part of the representation of Camelot as this barren land opposed from the natural world, but it's also interesting to note that this is in all likelihood historically accurate. The Dark Ages weren't just dark figuratively. There are more and more geohistorians that argue the era could have been close to a mini ice age as far as Europe was concerned. There are monastic accounts from the period that describe long periods of time where the sun would barely be seen, and there's mounting evidence that harsh environmental conditions were a large contributing factor to what we consider the Dark Ages. During the period, we see progress come grinding to a halt, especially in major projects that were of significant cultural interest at the time, like cathedral building. People saw this barren, harsh climate as a sign of God's abandonment, and when fair weather returned, building efforts resumed, and we see rapid advancement throughout Europe, the shift into medieval life, and a rekindled faith in the divine. Now, there's a lot of contributing factors to the Dark Ages, but culturally, an abandonment of God, or by God, isn't a bad way of putting it. And really, that's what's important here, because it's part and parcel with this discussion that's ongoing in the film between God and nature, that man's advancement and dominion over the landscape had perhaps angered God or the wrathful forces of nature. And Arthurian myth is one of many, many cultural tools that we use to romanticize and rationalize this period as part of this Christian Reformation and build medieval ideals and regalvanize Christian faith. So you can really see all these different themes and motifs welling together here in this semi-realist depiction of Camelot and early British Christianity. Gawain has done nothing valuable with his remaining year, continuing to frequent the pub and the brothel and generally do unknightly things. The fact that he has an axe that can make forests spring up out of nowhere in a kingdom without trees should give you some idea of what a selfish bitch this guy is currently. He squanders his time bragging about wielding the king's sword, he has a portrait commissioned, and we see signals of his vanity as he adjusts his hair. He's concerned with how he looks to others, how he is perceived, but doesn't concern himself with the right and wrong of his own actions, of his failings in virtue. We also see that the portrait isn't a perfect representation of Gawain, a reminder that man and legend don't currently match up, and a broader reminder that we often lose the wrinkles or the realities when telling a story or painting a portrait. That's driven home as the portrait of Gawain fades out to an overlapping shot of him drunkenly chugging beer just before fighting in the muddy street. And his failings in knightly prowess don't end there. After Essel makes fun of the rapidly forming legend of Sir Gawain, Severer of Melons, she also makes fun of him for being unable to get it up. And this is a trope as old as stories that a man's warrior prowess, in this case knightly prowess, is inherently linked to his sexual and masculine prowess. Very broadly speaking, that's why guns and swords will always be seen as phallic instruments. They're the implement of the masculine. They penetrate and are capable of affecting violent change through a form of conflict. Again, very broadly speaking. And so here, this is all another indicator of Gawain's discordance with where and who he should be, his current failings as a knight, and how this ties into his failings as a man. In fact, the king's sword was given to him after he repeats, "I need a sword," like a lost boy, and really the connotation is the same as his impotence. He's not yet a knight, and not yet a man, and so he lacks his sword, his weapon. Gawain's impotence is also foreshadowing that Gawain has desires beyond love, as he makes clear clear to Essel when he points out that she isn't a lady. He desires station and recognition and a wife that will further those goals. Gawain's misplaced desire is explored just as much through his sexuality as his knightly ambition, and so it makes sense that we see the two conflate here. And the chivalric code, of which Gawain is essentially the poster boy for, chivalric romance, medieval literature, they're all obsessed with sex and notions of correct sexual or romantic behaviour. It was just very limited in how candid it could be in its portrayals. For example, when Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, essentially flies into a presumably terrifying rape frenzy that can only be sated by the Queen of Tintagel, he is described as being an overly lusty knight. So here we see his failings as a knight reflected in his sexual prowess, but just keep in mind moving forward, that's because he's desiring the wrong things, which is why he has no issues getting it up when it's a lady that looks exactly like Essel, but from a higher social standing. As Gawain returns from his bar fight and his day of reckoning draws closer, we see him interrupt what looks to be a pretty nervous meeting between Arthur and Morgause. Either they're sharing concern over a plan they conceived of together that's now potentially going awry, or they're just both sharing concern over their loved one that now faces an uncertain conclusion. Expectedly, Gawain tries to shirk his responsibility and avoid his meeting with the knight. He seems incredulous that Arthur would expect him to participate in something that could cost him his life, despite being in control of every part of that decision up until this point. Arthur reminds him of his duty and asks if it's wrong to want greatness for him. He also doesn't seem too despondent about the prospect of Gawain's death, given that he has spent a lifetime surrounded by men who have become great due to their repeatedly facing death. And this tells us a couple of very important things about Arthur. Primarily, that he is accepting of a fate here where Gawain does not return, and secondly, that he does hold great stock in the importance of great deeds. But I don't think any part of him wants to force it on Gawain. I think for Arthur, the truly best outcome is that he gets to see what sort of man Gawain is, that Gawain and the rest of the world get to see it too. But as we know, Gawain's future doesn't lie in greatness, but in goodness, and Arthur definitely wants the best for Gawain. So to put it most simply, I think Arthur hopes Gawain makes the right choices, that he stays true to the oath of his covenant, and for Arthur that is enough to assure him Gawain is on the right path, despite his uncertainty about what lies at the end of it. And this conversation between greatness and goodness really is the heart of the film, and we see it get brought to the forefront during Gawain's last real conversation with Essel. She asks him, why greatness? Why is goodness not enough? And this is ultimately the choice Gawain is faced with at the end of the film. She's pleading with him to see that he doesn't need all the titles and station and power and recognition that he covets. He doesn't need to be concerned with being recognized as a great man once he's gone. He just needs to concern himself with being a good man now. While ultimately Gawain will make the right decision, his treatment of Essel here is far from being a good man. He rebuffs her hopes of having a life with him because he covets all the things she cannot give him, all the things he sees as necessities for greatness. And we're going to look at this in a lot greater detail later on, but it's no coincidence that our most outwardly Christian character is having this conversation, because it's here we find the answer to our Gawain as Jesus symbolism. While the film may draw parallels between the two, this is where it draws the key difference. Jesus is a man concerned with goodness that has to accept greatness. Gawain is a man concerned with greatness that has to accept goodness, and they both have to accept their own death to do so. As I say, we'll stick with that as we go through and look at it in a lot more detail as to how it's presented, but that's the heart of the allegory. For now though, what's mainly important is Gawain's offer of coin to Essel, confirmation that he's treating her like a whore when she really desires love. And the bell she gives him, and Essel in general, are symbolic of this honest life of Christian virtue. So during this quick montage of scenes before Gawain heads out, we see a lot of touching of Gawain's face. Most importantly, this caring cleaning of Gawain's face by Arthur, and these similarly comforting motions by his mother as if she's very timidly checking his temperature. Now, touch and sensation and desire play a huge role in this film, and touch in general is very important in chivalric romance. That's the main reason Dev Patel has so much bare skin throughout this film. But these two touches in particular have continued relevance later in the film. For now, just keep the Arthur one in mind as evidence for his clear care for Gawain. I also think it's worth noting the look of appreciation and closeness Morgause displays as she sees this happening. There really isn't any visible animosity between her and Arthur in this film, and again, I think this suggests their goals are more aligned than one first assumes. As for Morgause's hand movements, this is almost certainly part of the enchantment of the sash. We see the coven get to work on it shortly after, and this becomes more clear later on when we see the exact same thing precede the creation of the second sash. We see a couple more ingredients to the spell as the sash is put together, some creepy red moss, and what appear to be a reasonably close match to Anglo-Saxon rune shapes, presumably a rune of protection, although I couldn't quite find a fitting translation. Perhaps Bur meaning birth, which would make some sense given the matriarchal relationship with the protectee, and this Christ is born and reborn metaphor we're softly employing on him. But honestly, it's a bit of a shot in the dark, and it would make more sense for them to be early British rather than Anglo-Saxon. During this section, we also get a proper introduction to the Pentangle that adorns Gawain's shield, symbolizing the 5 points of Gawain's chivalric covenant. While most knights would typically have carried a shield bearing a symbol of battle or bravery, Gawain breaks from tradition by bearing the emblem of the Pentangle, a symbol of the virtues Gawain traditionally embodies as a sort of moral representative of the court of Camelot. Each of the 5 points represents its own set of 5, and if you're wondering why 5, well, there isn't a great answer for that. The first time the word Pentangle appears written down, and the creation of the symbol as being representative of knightly virtues, is in the original poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And the rest of the story is far more concerned with the number 3, which is a much more common rule in storytelling. From early fairy tales to Alfred Hitchcock to musical structure, things generally come in 3s, often with an essential difference on the third thing. As to why the anonymous Gawain poet chose 5 here, the answer likely lies in Christian influence. This blessing or covenant is directly related to Christianity, specifically the Virgin Mary, which is why we see her on the interior of the shield, pointed towards Gawain's heart. In the Middle Ages, medieval number theory was widely embraced by scholars and the clergy as a way of mimicking the divine geometry employed by God during the creation of the universe. It's possible, likely even, that 5's significance in this practice is why we see it feature so heavily here, and that the emphasis of 5s on 5s is another way of linking this symbol and these knights to Christian mythos. Let's go through what each point stands for in the order the film gives them to us. So first we have the 5 fingers. For a knight, the hands are of utmost importance, and this represents his skill in battle and strength in arm. Because the chivalrous knight is seen as an instrument of God, there's also this connotation of them being the hand of God and the fingers belonging to him. Second is the 5 senses. Gawain is described as being faultless in his 5 senses. This is a mark of a good knight, one who can rely on his senses in battle. There is also an aspect of truth to the idea that a knight trusts what is real and sees the world around him for what it is and is able to react accordingly. Next is the 5 joys, specifically the 5 joys of the Virgin Mary from the New Testament: the Annunciation, Nativity, Resurrection, Ascension, and Assumption. If Gawain is a good knight and upholds this paradigm of Christianity, then Mary will then serve as a source of strength and courage and protection to him. Fourth up is the 5 wounds, representing the 5 wounds of Christ during the crucifixion, the 4 stigmata wounds in palms and feet, and then the piercing of the spear in the side by the Roman soldier Longinus. A good knight, a true knight, would endeavor to preserve righteousness and chivalry even if this means the loss of life. As Christ died on the cross, so must Gawain be willing to lose his head without fear in order to defend the honor of Arthur's court. And lastly, we have the 5 virtues of a knight: generosity, brotherly love, pure mind, good manners, and compassion, which are meant to guide Gawain in his everyday doings, his manner, and his conduct. Overall, the Pentangle is designed to resemble truth and honor and the sacred bond Gawain has taken, his chivalric covenant. As we'll see with the Gawain in The Green Knight, however, it serves more closely as a list of his failings. The biggest point of note during this sequence, though, is undoubtedly Morgause being the one who originally gives Gawain the sash. As we move through, we see the lady also present Gawain with an identical sash, like in the original poem, but for now, because of the shift from Morgana to Morgause, changing motivations, it's Gawain's mother giving him the magical sash that will keep him safe. It's a big departure from the source material. In the original poem, the sash is first emblematic of Gawain breaking his covenant, and seeing as this version is already failing his covenant, it makes sense that he should have it from the beginning. Also, it makes sense that this character is Morgause because of her decision here. Morgana wouldn't care to keep Gawain safe, and Morgause isn't giving it to him as proof of his capability for deceit. She's giving it to him to legitimately keep her son safe so that he can fulfill his path for greatness as she sees it. Without this, her plan would simply be, let my son get beheaded, which wouldn't make a lot of sense. So yes, this is possibly the biggest departure one could take from the original Gawain story, even more so than changing the ending. This changes the whole message. But it's also a departure that makes intimate sense given the alteration from Morgana to Morgause. It's conjecture, but I am of the opinion that she potentially sees both futures for Gawain, the one where he is good and the one where he is great, and realizes that whatever her son chooses will result in a net positive for her. While Arthur is hoping that he proves himself to be a good man, Morgause realizes that whether her son is good or great, it's of benefit to her. And let's lean more towards greatness there, because maybe she believes her son will choose goodness like Arthur does, but I don't think she'd be this eager to see a plan through that she was 50-50 on resulting in the death of her son. And we see her stay by his side during the great ending, and we know she wants him to have the sash with him, so I think it's safe to say she's trying to bet safe. but we don't know for certain that the Green Knight beheads Gawain. In fact, traditionally he doesn't, and ultimately that means there isn't any real reason to think he does here, given that we don't see it. But I think we can say for sure that Morgause is at least betting on keeping Gawain safe, whether she knows what the final outcome will be or not. Before we move on, let's talk about what the sash exactly symbolizes for a moment. So in the original text, the sash is first a symbol of Gawain's breaking of his covenant. His seduction and temptation by the lady lead to him finally accepting the sash, lying to the knight and trying very humanly to stay alive. When he returns to Camelot after the events of the finale, this sash becomes quite the opposite. Perhaps more realistically, the Knights of Camelot see Gawain's decision to want to live, but being truthful in every other respect, as a sign of his honesty and loyalty to the chivalric covenant. Due to this, they all adopt the sash as tribute to that honesty and his honourable decisions. In The Green Knight, however, right from the jump, we see the sash as a sign of Gawain's dishonesty, and during the flash-forward ending, we see it become a millstone, a weight of dishonesty and cowardice that eventually he needs to free himself from in order to truly accept the outcome. We kind of see this outright, not necessarily difference, but certainly exaggeration of the original motif when the lady later gives Gawain the sash and he ejaculates on it. We'll go into it in more detail then, but naturally the sexual release on the symbol of chivalric valor that outlasts his entire potential existence is a bit of a nail in the coffin of this Gawain matching up to the one of legend. As we see Gawain embark on the journey out, we get this amazing long take of him riding away from Camelot that really lets you feel part of this fantasy world and conveys the barrenness of Camelot too. It is the middle of winter, of course, but in most recent fantasy efforts, we see Camelot as this verdant, evergreen utopia. And here we're trying to suggest the opposite. This isn't a land of plenty. This is a land brought to its knees by conquest and desire. I love how we see Gawain maintain this sort of regal, proud posture and expression as the children follow him out of Camelot, and how we see it turn to fear once he's no longer being watched. He's hyper concerned with his legend before he's even lived it. His desire for notoriety and recognition is another building block of all of Gawain's desires being misplaced and selfish. Whether it's vanity, cowardice, temptation, this Gawain is always after the wrong thing, the less honourable thing. Something we haven't discussed yet, which will be with Gawain throughout the movie, is his cloak or mantle, which Gawain has with him during the original poem. There it is described as being golden, but here is not really gold so much as mustardy yellow. And I think there's pretty good reason for this. Now, I think the obvious connotation here with yellow is cowardice. This has been a long-standing trait of the colour, along with treachery, sin, heresy, and jealousy. But let's say predominantly and most notably cowardice. We see Gawain donned in it essentially through his journey into cowardice. It even partially covers his neck, so that fits with not wanting to be decapitated, and we see him dressed in all yellow during the opening scene where we're getting this preliminary hallucination of a life where he chooses cowardice. But there is an even more crucial connotation working in parallel with this. During the early Middle Ages, yellow was used as a cheap alternative to gold leaf in depicting divine light in art and manuscripts, and Gawain is most definitely depicted here as a divine figure, a failing one, but a divine one. And so we see this beautiful yellow cloak getting stained and sullied, just like his sash, just like his divinity and virtue, as he falls further and further from grace. I should point out that the journey to the Green Chapel is by far the biggest break from the traditional narrative route, mainly because it barely exists. Everything from Gawain leaving Camelot to encountering the Lord's Castle is pretty much the film's own invention based on very small suggestions by the poem. I'll put the entire section on screen. We have mention of giants and a spring, and we'll look at that as we're going through and the real world influences behind those, because this film has found some incredibly creative ways to draw on the wider narrative of the Gawain mythos and British history. Not long after leaving the safety of Camelot, Gawain seems to be riding through the edges of the kingdom, the newest reaches of Arthur's conquest. There's definitely this feeling of him crossing a threshold into a new domain, be that a purgatorial land of the dead, given the abundance of bodies and sparsity of life, or just the more paganistic wilderness that surrounds the well-developed Camelot. Whichever is the case, it certainly continues this theme of man's development and battles for conquest ravaging the natural world around them. The land is surreal, devastated and lifeless, just an endless field of bodies and mud and broken infrastructure, all browns and greys rather than greens and reds. We meet Barakian's scavenger, whose comments about his brothers verge on suggesting the field is some kind of purgatory too. He's vague and direct at the same time, saying he has two brothers that marched off and never came home, and while he may be talking about this battle, or he may just be lying, I feel as though it's something more abstract than that. Maybe they left years ago and one day he expects to see their face turn up on a battlefield somewhere. Or even more surreal, surreal than that. Perhaps this is an endless field of the damned being traversed by lost spirits as they're tested before the afterlife. From the point Gawain crosses into the battlefield, everything starts to feel a lot more ethereal and surreal, but I don't think he's died or anything, at least not here. It's just signaling that he's moving into this more mystical realm where the line between life and death is significantly more blurred. The scavenger softly confirms that the battle was the work of the king, without naming Arthur, and again we see the idea of legend versus reality being played with, as the scavenger suggests the king killed 900 men on his own. It's not just having fun for the sake of it though, it's this sort of word-of-mouth storytelling that led to the fractured creation of Arthurian myth in the first place. In fact, this is actually a direct reference to the 9th century historian Nennius, who compiled a series of works called The History of the Britons. In it, we see early inklings of Arthur being built into a mythical figure, due mainly to Nennius's claim that Arthur single-handedly killed 900 Saxons at the Battle of Badon. And seeing as we know this Arthur has just got done beating back the Saxons, that makes it extremely likely that this battlefield is supposed to be that of the Battle of Badon. And given that we see that Arthur can barely lift his sword, that's a pretty clear delineation on how this film views the idea of legend versus reality. It doesn't need to match exactly. Pure heroism may not be an attainable concept in reality, but it's moments like Arthur may have had and like Gawain is going to face at the end, that really matter when you're building a legend. While the scavenger probably would have tried to rob Gawain anyway, it's worth noting that this is the source of their disagreement, that Gawain didn't pay for assistance on the road when he could have. If a knight had nothing to offer, then thanks would have been fine under chivalric code, but a knight with a full purse asking for help on the road and not offering anything in return was absolutely a failure to uphold the covenant. It's minor, but it's there and it's still significant because it means everything negative that befalls Gawain essentially occurs because of his failings as a knight. Once he has Gawain captured, the scavenger will repeat that it wasn't enough, suggesting there may have been a scenario where Gawain's generosity would have kept him free from being accosted. Something else that would definitely be considered a failure is being bested in combat by a woman and allowing your horse and armaments to be taken from you, which is exactly what happens next. And this is one of several points in the movie where it shows the realities and capabilities of women to be far greater than chivalric romance and medieval literature gave them credit for. Just like it problematizes the idea of the men in the tales being borderline infallible heroes and brave warriors, so too does it problematize the notion of women as damsels without agency. We see Gawain once again state that he is not a knight, this time in the hopes of keeping himself alive. The scavenger says Gawain told him he was a knight, but Gawain says, "I didn't say that, you said that." Essentially meaning, I just let you think that. And again, it's a building block of Gawain's pride and vanity getting him in trouble. If he'd said outright he wasn't a knight, he again may have avoided the robbery. The scavenger takes Gawain's sash from him, and his gang break Gawain's shield, jumping on it to crack it in half across the neckline, and symbolise the fate that awaits Gawain without his shield blessed by Mary and his sash blessed by witchcraft. The two items designed to protect him and keep him safe. The breaking of the icon of Mary comes right after the scavenger's assertion that Gawain is already in the chapel, essentially the world of the natural where your Christian icons aren't recognised or venerated. There's also this really creepy repetition of Gawain's pleas that nicely sums up what's going on in this scene, which is the problematization of chivalry and knightly heroism. Gawain's first encounter away from the protection of his king leads to him being robbed and potentially murdered by a gang of bandits, and all he can muster is pleas. Whether you think he dies here or not, the film is certainly having fun with the idea of the brave knight setting out in his quest to be immediately robbed and killed by peasants who had no notions of or use for overly romanticized codes of conduct during their day-to-day lives living in excrement and starvation. And yes, there is a very good chance Gawain does die here. We definitely spend a lot of time with the idea, so let's look at exactly what happens on screen during this sequence. So we get to see Gawain tied up without either of the objects designed to keep him protected. He doesn't get stabbed or anything like that. It's all build up to him being beheaded, so if we start stabbing him now, we'd be removing a lot of the threat. The scavenger is swinging around wildly with the great axe, and it gets in his head that if Gawain could play at being a knight, then he can too. He walks over to Gawain and says, "You rest your bones, my brave little knight. I'll finish your quest for you." Now, as we know, this has significance for where we next see the axe, and it's important to remember the scavenger is intent on playing the role of a knight for when we get there. There's also the reference to Gawain's bones, which potentially in real life, and certainly in mythos, Gawain's remains have had a pretty storied time. But obviously we also see Gawain's skeleton shortly after, so there's the more pressing allusion to the fact that this may well cause the death of Gawain. So from there, we see Scavenger ride away on Gawain's horse, and his bandit gang go optimistically running after him. Gawain remains tied up, and we get this crazy double 360 panning shot from a live Gawain to his skeleton and then back round to a live Gawain again. The film spends 2 full minutes on this single shot, and regardless of how you read it, it's almost certainly of significance. There's a few things of note in how this scene is constructed. First and foremost, the pan around is deliberately slow and uses emphasized nature sounds to impart the idea of time passing. As the camera moves around, we see the colors very subtly becoming brighter, greens becoming more verdant and lush. And then, as we move towards Gawain's deceased body, we see nature, life springing up all around him and over him. A demonstration of nature's creeping power, the power of the green, as the lady will later describe, and Gawain's inevitable succumbing to his place in the natural cycle. When we get the reverse shot, we see the color drain back from the scene as unsettling thunder rolls in, and if you listen very carefully, even some of the nature sounds playing in reverse. That, combined with the camera moving back in opposition to its original route, is all designed to suggest a reversal of the flow of time. We then see Gawain's consciousness seemingly jump back into his body and him desperately beginning to free himself. As he does free himself, we see his sword cutting into his fingers and palms, both of which were crucial to his covenant, the 5 fingers and the 5 wounds of Christ. It's a clever way of showing he no longer has Mary's protection, as well as the fact that he's failing to uphold his covenant. So one of 2 things has happened here. Either Gawain has had a vision of himself laying there and dying, which terrified him and motivated him to escape, and honestly, don't rule it out because that's exactly what we see at the end before he decides to be honest, or he did actually die and now he's waking up somewhere else entirely. In the big panning shot, we see the reality of Gawain's physical state, reclaimed by nature after decomposing, and then we see time reverse to the moment of Gawain's passing, his surge back to consciousness in an afterlife, some purgatory or limbo that he must find his way back from. The film is abstract enough that it's always going to be possible to argue that he's dead or alive following this. It's designed to keep that and many other things deliberately fluid. This could be a moment of fear or the moment where reality fails and legend takes over. To say he's alive or dead concretely is missing the point the film is making somewhat. We're going to look at that in more detail next, and we're going to keep all possibilities in mind as we move through. But if you're wanting definite answers here, I would lean towards yes, he does die. Not only because this is a lot of very purposeful screen time for a half-meant motif, but also because I think there's a pretty awesome explanation as to how he can be dead here and potentially alive later, and that brings us very neatly onto a meeting with St Winifred. And I know I said that everything takes on a more ethereal tone as Gawain crosses into the battlefield, but even more so we see a noticeable shift towards the abstract and supernatural as soon as Gawain leaves the glade where he was tied up. Things start getting foggier very rapidly, and in no time at all everything is dark and misty and threatening. Before long he arrives at a rather surreal cottage in the middle of nowhere with an eerie light glowing behind it. He sees a chance for shelter and goes and tucks himself up in bed, much to the ire of the deceased Winifred. And Winifred is most certainly dead, yet we see her walking around talking with Gawain. We see her skeleton like we do Gawain, so I think it's a pretty big plus point to the argument of Gawain being dead during this part. And given that we see her bones are actually right where he's laying a little later, we know he's not just seeing a ghost, but he's also in some ghostly reflection of the real world. A kind of Stranger Things style limbo that frequents the same space on a separate plane of reality. Although he reaches out in fear and confusion, his effort to touch Winifred, especially given the traumatic context of her predicament, is a failure to conduct himself properly, touching a lady without her permission. And rightfully she says, "Why would you ever do that?" confused as to why this supposed knight is acting so unknightly. Winifred tells Gawain the story that led to her losing her head. A roaming knight had tried to rape her and she'd fought him off, only for him to return later and decapitate her, throwing her head in the spring next to her cottage. She asks Gawain to retrieve her head for her, and once again we see him fail to uphold his covenant when he asks Winifred what's in it for him. This presumably has a sexual subtext to it. It was quite common in chivalric romance for a knight to be offered a kiss by a lady upon fulfilling some deed or becoming her champion. To ask her for it though was bold at the very least, and here Gawain is essentially propositioning a postmodern rape victim, so that's more than a little bold for sure. But even if it was just payment he was seeking, he's still acting selfishly and leading with desire rather than treating her with the care and sympathy she deserves. Once he realizes his error, Gawain does decide to help her retrieve her head, and in doing so proves his virtue without promise of reward. Now really on the face of it, that's all this scene is telling you happens. He magically finds his axe propped against the wall and continues on his way. But naturally there's a lot more going on here during this at first quite confusing interval. Let's start with who is St Winifred, because that's pretty crucial. St Winifred, or St Winifred of Wales, was a 7th century woman who was pursued by a prince named Caradog. According to the story, somewhere around the year 630 AD, Winifred attempted to escape Caradog's increasingly rapacious advances by fleeing to her uncle's church to become a nun. Caradog pursued her and cut off her head. In the legend, a natural spring blossomed into being at the spot where her head fell to the ground. Her uncle then emerged from the church next to the spring and put her head back onto her body, miraculously bringing her back to life while while the ground opened up and swallowed Caradoc. The legend of St Winifred was popularized in the 1100s, and by the 12th century, the spring had become a formal religious site known as St Winifred's Well, renowned for the healing properties in the water. Not only that, but most Arthurian scholars agree that a fleeting reference in the original Gawain poem, referencing Gawain visiting Holyhead in North Wales on his journey to the chapel, is actually a reference to Winifred's Well. So the subtext is kept hidden, but once you know the story of St Winifred, it actually becomes relatively clear. And if you're the sort of person that needs one definite explanation, we essentially have it here. Gawain is left to starve and die by the bandits, which he does. Time passes and we find him waking up in limbo, where he frees himself, wanders a while, and comes to the spring with St Winifred. She's another lost soul, searching to become complete, and his decision to help her without benefit to himself proves his virtue and gives him the opportunity to cross back into the land of the living via the magical healing properties of the spring. And that actually makes total sense when you rewatch it. We see this strange shift in colour when he enters the pool, and it seems to be almost endless. We also get these crazy shots of the universe in all its beautiful glory, and all of this is him literally being born or reborn, moving from the afterlife back to the real, and seeing the sort of fabric of space and all reality in that cataclysmic moment he crashes back into existence. I think this shot of the universe is extremely important to the Gawain is dead or did die theory, because along with the 2-minute panning shot of Gawain's corpse, what do these shots really mean if he isn't dead for this part? And as we see him lay Winifred's head to rest, the sun rises up almost immediately, kind of signaling that his quest, or trial perhaps, has been completed and he's transitioned back into reality and away from the black misty limbo he's been wandering through. But again, I'd shy away from leaning into any reading concretely here. The film is obsessed with rendition and adaptation, and like I've said, it doesn't want you to consider just one narrative. In fact, the dialogue with Winifred actually gives us some pretty major insight into what the film is thinking in this regard. This scene is deliberately disjointed, with the viewer unsure at first as to if Winifred is alive or dead, just like they are with Gawain, and then further confused with how the actually dead Winifred is conversing with Gawain if he is alive. Gawain is confused as well, asking, "Are you real or are you a spirit?" And Winifred's answer is extremely important. She says, "What's the difference? I just need to find my head." And as far as the movie is concerned, there really isn't a difference. Whether plunged into a world of illusion or fighting for his eternal salvation, the outcome is the same. He's in a purgatorial battle to prove his virtue, to prove what sort of man he is. Whether he is alive or dead, the film's already told you it isn't important. What is important is that he finds his head, so to speak. In this case, his honor and courage and sense of duty. That is what he needs to achieve. His story is not to become King of Camelot. His story is to become the icon of chivalry, of doing the right thing. Whether alive or dead, myth or reality, Gawain does what's expected of him in the end and fulfills his role in history. His actual life, as the film points out and plays with many times, is irrelevant. It's his story and what he represents that's important to us. All the playing around they've been doing about this being a retelling of a retelling isn't just for literary flair. It's to provide meaning here regarding this limbo state of, is he alive or is he dead? And the answer the film presents is that it doesn't matter if he's dead, alive or ever lived, because his story and the important parts of him, what he means, what his legend means, that's all very much alive. Really, I think it's all true. He is dead, he isn't, he's in limbo, he was resurrected. It depends what version of Gawain we're talking about. This is a story concerned with the telling of stories, the telling of itself over and over. That's why it wants you to go find out about St Winifred, why it's so keen to tie in other folklore like the Gawain poet tied in the Iliad, to give itself credibility and position itself as part of this wider canon, this millennia sprawling mythos of Arthurian narratives. It's weaving its way through a world of myth and history and folklore and limbo and life and death, and this Gawain is traversing the space between all of them, trying to figure out what sort of man he needs to be for his story to have the right ending. And I don't want to stray too much into the ending yet, but this conversation with Winifred and her laissez-faire view on mortality is important to that too. The message the film really leaves you with, the message Gawain ultimately has to learn, is not to spend your life afraid of death. To live your life well for the sake of well living, rather than living trying to produce a set outcome or certain recognition. To not fear what you can't avoid. And now she's on the other side of the mortal coil, this is how Winifred sees it. What's the difference? This is the person she needed to be. Decapitated, then restored. No doubt a tale of tragedy. Gawain must embrace his fate like she does. And subsequently so must we in our lives. We all have a date at the Green Chapel ahead of us, and we should choose to live well until it comes. Before we move on from Winifred, there is the question of the axe. Now option one is that the axe is a magical item, and now Gawain has proved himself worthy of undertaking the quest. The same forces that restored his life in the spring have seen to it that he has the item of destiny back with him. I think this is likely what's happened, but option two isn't necessarily mutually exclusive. The scavenger, intent on playing knight, was the knight that showed up and murdered Winifred. And I think that is the case as well. It certainly fits with the rest of his behaviour. That's why the focus is put on him finishing the knightly quest that he has no idea of the terms of. This is what he's seen knights do, act barbarously, and that's what he goes and does. And it's what Winifred's seen knights do. That's why we have this moment where she sincerely asks Gawain if it was him. Again, we've got the blurring of stories and people playing multiple roles, the scavenger becoming the knight because he looks the part, just like Gawain had looked the part to him. You can even see the scavenger practicing for the role as he repeats Gawain's "my thanks to you." And more importantly than that, it's a commentary on the barbarity and rapaciousness of every knight, and again, problematizing notions of actual chivalry and the treatment of women at the time. Her pressing of Gawain on this can also be seen as asking him if he's certain he wouldn't behave like this, as part of the deeper sort of purgatorial test of his soul that he's going through at the spring. And while he does pass the test, the presence of the axe does have pretty grim implications for the state of his honour, because if Gawain had been a good knight, if he'd upheld his covenant, then the scavenger would never have stolen the axe. He would never have been off playing knight and doing horrible things to Winifred. So while Gawain is certain when he answers, he may have felt differently if she'd have asked him after he'd seen the axe. Even though some of them are very tenuous in terms of blame, every bad thing that happens in this film is in some way due to Gawain's failings as a knight. Before we move on, we have Winifred's parting warning to Gawain. The Green Knight is someone you know. Now this is definitely referring to his mother being behind the plot, but the Green Knight seems to suggest they actually are that person. We never see this as being confirmed. If anything, it looks like Morgause is more controlling the Green Knight or signing a pact with him than actually being him, like she actually is the crone. We also don't see any evidence that she can gender swap in her shapeshifting. And in the original, this is the case. The Lord is the knight, Morgana is the old lady, and so on. Plus, it's not much of a reveal or a puzzler for the audience. We've known she's been behind the Green Knight since he was introduced. I also don't think you say someone you know to describe a maternal relationship. I think this line is actually a pretty major clue that in this version of the story, Arthur is involved in this test of Gawain somehow. Both he and Morgause are the someone you know. Arthur senses he's coming to the end of his reign and he needs to see what sort of a man, what sort of a king his heir will be. And most crucially, for the theory of it being Arthur, someone you know entirely rules out the Lord. Gawain has not met him yet, if he even exists in any traditional sense for Gawain to meet him, nor has he heard of him, and so we know for certain this time that the Lord is not the Green Knight. Although certainly, the Lord could be the same person that's also pretending to be the Green Knight. But after Lord Bertilak though, we pretty much start running out of male characters for the knight to be here except Arthur. And there's even more compelling evidence coming up that I think takes this from theory to certainty. With Gawain reborn in the sunny light of day and with his axe in hand, he has some of his virtue restored slightly. He's helped the damsel without hope of reward, and with his retrieval of the axe, he no longer finds himself disarmed and unable to fulfill terms with the Green Knight. He sets off from Winifred's and continues his journey to the chapel. It's during this section that we meet the fox, because it wouldn't be an A24 movie without a demonically possessed mammal of some kind. We're going to look at the fox in more detail later on when he starts talking, but for now, all you really need to know is that broadly, the fox is symbolic of Gawain. In the original poem, it at least represents his slyness and quick wit that he needs to demonstrate in order to navigate the trials of the mind and soul that he faces. And that's pretty much the same in this film up to a point. We see Gawain and the fox take shelter in a cave and eat some presumably hallucinogenic mushrooms he finds growing from the rock wall, and tripping off mushrooms can easily explain the subsequent visions of giants, but again, I think it's a touch more abstract than that. I think rather than simply hallucinating the giants, the hallucinogenic properties have allowed him to see things he couldn't normally. Essentially how druids and shamans understood the effects of hallucinogens. Mythology and mind-altering drugs have always shared a pretty close relationship. Here it's some intradimensional Rick Strassman ESP that lets Gawain see into the land of the gods, or rather, see the gods that walk among us, now abandoned by the modernizing world around them. The fox eats the mushrooms too, and they are seemingly sharing the same hallucination, which lends credence to the idea that the giants are actually there. They could of course just be there and be giants and no one is hallucinating. Giants are mentioned in the Gawain poem at this point, and so it could just be that they're an accepted part of this universe. I think Gawain's shock at their presence and their acknowledgement of Gawain though seem to lean towards this not being a regular occurrence between humans and giants. And just who are these giants? Well, this is another case where I've seen several review sites just say they're essentially unexplained, but I'm pretty certain they are the Tuatha Dé Danann, a gigantic and often angelic group of star-traveling settlers to Early Island that play a heavy role in Celtic mythology. Arthurian myth is an amalgam of British, Welsh, Irish and French mythology, and this pagan wilderness we see Gawain traverse on his way to the Green Chapel is almost certainly representative of Wales and Ireland. We know Winifred's spring was in northern Wales, so it makes perfect sense that he started to encounter Irish folklore after that. The Tuatha Dé Danann story is honestly perfect fodder for ancient aliens and worthy of its own video, but for the purposes of what's going on here and how we know it's them in this film, it's primarily because of their seemingly female-centric group and their odd whale song-like chorus, something the Tuatha Dé Danann were renowned for. Danann is a female-gendered term, and while there certainly are male members of the race in folklore, they are primarily matriarchal and designated with female terms. Here we see every member portrayed by a woman, although some of them are more androgynous than others. It's likely, given their quite prominent position in British and Irish folklore, that these giants are the ones being referenced in the original Gawain poem also. Although there are other famous stories of giants around Ireland, they do mostly all stem from the same source, which is the Tuatha Dé Danann. So while Winifred and the giants may seem like odd additions to the story at first, they are both based squarely in the original verse and the surrounding local folklore. Gawain asks the giants for help in traversing the valley, and one of them stops to offer it. As we see later with the Beheading Game, his response is one of fear. He is not pure of heart. It's also another example of his misplaced desire. He asks for something he's scared to receive. He doesn't know what he wants. The fox howls at the giant and she quickly pulls her hand away. The giant begins to sing mournfully and the others join in. I think this is a lamentation of Gawain's current unworthiness and a kind of whale call warning to the other magical beings in the valley that he isn't pure of heart. So after a little bit more travelling and this beautiful clock turn shot that's again designed to demonstrate the passage of time, Gawain arrives at the castle of Lord Bertilak, although like Arthur and everyone else, he is given a deliberately more vague title, simply being referred to as the Lord. And as we've established, he is not the Green Knight, or at least not the character behind the Green Knight as he is in the original poem. One thing I would point out with the whole shape-shifting magic at work is that it doesn't seem to alter hair or gender, and the Lord does have a very similar beard to the Green Knight. The same can pretty much be said of Arthur too, although his is slightly better kept. As we meet the Lord, we get a quick visual homage to Midsommar, and honestly a lot of the themes are transferable: life, death, the natural cycle, virility and fertility, and so on. And from here, the film really does turn up the dial on its exploration of sexuality, so it's probably a good place for it. While it may get a good deal more explicit than the original Gawain story, there has been literal centuries of academic work suggesting that the kisses in Gawain and the Green Knight stand for something more than just chivalric politeness. So this isn't exactly out of the blue. As I mentioned, chivalric romance and medieval literature in general were heavily concerned with correct sexual conduct, but they weren't exactly liberal with their expression of it. There's also always been the lingering question of homosexual desire between Gawain and Lord Bertilak. It's made far more present and purposeful in this film, but again, it's a long debated theory that has been present since scholars started unpacking the original verse. Really. That being said, in that original verse, it is for the most part simply something that happens. They all share kisses. Gawain kisses the Lord several times, in fact, but keeps the sash a secret. The kisses to the Lord are more likely intended as courtly politeness rather than lust, but nonetheless signaled to the Lord what his wife had been doing. The kisses between Lady Bertilak and Gawain are most definitely sexual, however, because she tries further seducing him following them. Traditionally, Gawain resists this seduction, but here we have a very different, failing Gawain who finds himself falling to temptation, causing him to break his covenant all over his sash. It's important to remember that all of this, but specifically this ordeal at the castle, is a test of Gawain's honour, of how he upholds his covenant. Usually the lady is a test of purity and sexual proclivity, and the Lord is a test of his honesty. Here the Lord is a sexual test as well. And if pre- and extramarital sex were frowned upon by Christian and chivalric values, then it's fair to say homosexuality certainly was as well. Throughout the film, there's this focus on bare skin and touch and desire, people constantly touching on or around Gawain's face. Here we see Lord Bertilak doing it, and while he is trying to tend to a recently collapsed Gawain, there is a definite uncomfortable undertone here that can be interpreted as desire, given the later events with the Lord. Other than the more apparent homosexuality and him not being the man behind the Green Knight, most of the other events stay the same. Primarily the agreement that the Lord will give Gawain the best of the day's hunt, and Gawain in return will give him whatever he might win during the day. And if when I mentioned Caradog earlier, your mind jumped to a certain Witcher character, it should now be thinking this sounds very familiar to a certain deal Geralt makes about that which you have but do not yet know. And yes, The Witcher is certainly influenced in places by Arthurian myth and medieval literature in general, and so none of this is coincidental. So with all that out of the way, let's address the two elephants in the room. Why is Alicia Vikander playing two roles here, and what's up with the old woman with the blindfold? I've seen a couple of review sites suggesting that this double role is a nod to medieval theatre, where actors would often play more than one villain role. And sure, maybe, it certainly fits with how the film is playing with retellings and adaptations and so on, but truthfully, I don't think this is really the case, at least not the primary meaning. If it were, Gawain would be aware rather than totally weirded out by the identical appearance. As with everything else on his journey, I think it's another part of his test of virtue, and so he is presented with a woman that looks exactly like Essel, the woman whose heart he already occupies, but that also offers all the things that Essel does not, like station and highborn blood. All the things Gawain covets and the reason he keeps Essel at a distance. The lady is a wife worthy of a knight, or at least Gawain perceives her to be. Once again, Gawain is presented with the choice between greatness and goodness, proper and improper desire, and once again he will make the wrong choice through selfish lust. You could say she looks like Essel because she represents the ultimate trial of Gawain's virtue. It's not just a matter of refusing seduction, it's a matter of him betraying the woman that loves him based solely on differences in station, of what Essel cannot offer him. Making the lady look like Essel is also another trick to seducing Gawain. He's clearly attracted to her already, and so this is the guise that the witches choose to tempt him with. They use the sexual confusion created by it to lure Gawain into giving into their side. As we find out more about her though, we realize that Essel and the lady are very different people. Essel is warm and loving and Christian. The lady is the complete opposite, a witch and a cold seductress playing games with Gawain. It's not just Gawain's betrayal of Essel that renders this a breach of covenant. This lady is also a married woman, a sacred bond under God as far as the medieval church was concerned. And not just a wife, but the wife of the host, and respect to the hosting party was another big component of medieval literature and proper chivalric behavior. So given that it's already evident that there's some shape-shifting going on here, let's address a minor question before moving on. Are the Lord and Lady real? In the original, both of them are most certainly real. The Lord simply is transformed into the Green Knight via Morgana's magic, but he certainly exists underneath. Here though, that very likely isn't the case. We don't see any observable connection between the Lord and the plan, save for the passing resemblance of the beard, and we know the lady isn't Essel or just some chance doppelganger. In fact, it's probable that the lady is one or several of Morgause's coven. Not only is she a confirmed witch, but she also has the same haircut as two of them at differing points of the movie. As with Arthur and the Green Knight, the relatively limited scope of the cast doesn't really provide much alternative as to who this lady could be. And to make things even creepier, given their unique ethnicity, age, close relation to Morgause, and the nature of women in Gawain's family, it's very likely that these witches in Morgause's coven are Gawain's sisters, and subsequently what we're going to see occur is extremely incestuous. So if the lady is one or several of the witches, sort of transmogrified, then I think we can pretty safely assume the Lord is too. We don't ever get any confirmation of who he really is. I do still think there's a connection between him, the knight, and Arthur, whether that be literal shapeshifting or them just representing similar things to Gawain, the link is still there. But we have no real reason to presume that he is a real lord that exists outside of Gawain's experiences with him, and his explanation that he won't be at the castle on Gawain's return seems to softly disclose that he only exists here for the purpose of Gawain's story. As for the crone, if you really want her to be, then sure, she could be the actual Morgana, but I think truthfully it's made pretty explicit that this is Morgause in disguise, just like the lady is one of her younger witches in disguise. Other than that change, the crone character operates just as she does in the original, silently observing from behind her blindfold, doing her best to manipulate the outcome she desires. During the exchange at breakfast, the Lord gives us some pretty definite foreshadowing for the ending, and there's been a lot of Gawain is definitely going to die foreshadowing up until now, but this one in particular has a very clever double edge. He says, "You were at the end of your quest, Garwin, a little sooner than you expected perhaps, but such is the case for us all." Now, whether you think Gawain died in the glade or if you think he probably dies at the end, this line is obviously pretty clear foreshadowing for his time being up, and it also is layering in the film's final message that death is an inescapable part of life that we have to make our peace with if we are to live well. To live afraid of it is to live in cowardice, and here we see the Lord trying to drive that home to Gawain. In between breakfast and the library, we get some beautiful quick shots of Gawain acquainting himself with the castle, and we see him pause on the mural of the fox being pursued by a hunter. As I've mentioned, really the fox here is just supposed to be referential of Gawain, and we see this confirmed about 15 minutes later when Gawain sees a similar but opposite mural, and this time in place of the fox, we see a figure resembling Gawain being pursued by the hunt in a very familiar yellow cloak. Next up, we have the scene with the lady and Gawain in the library, and this is another example of the film's female characters not being what we expect them to be, problematizing chivalry's depiction of women as damsels, shrews, and seductresses. She is learned, well-read at least. She doesn't just transcribe the book, she also makes alterations where she sees fit, which is a knowing nod to the film playing around with ideas of retelling and adaptation and these stories changing over time. She's a woman changing history or literature in a film featuring a changed history of literature and a changed history history of women. Even just the fact that she can read and is allowed to would be mind-boggling at the time. So there's also an element that she's doing things she isn't supposed to be, acquiring knowledge that she isn't supposed to have. As we'll see, these books may very well be the source of her desire to adulter. Obviously, she's part of the plan to manipulate Gawain, but both readings should be understood. On the surface level, the seductory role she's playing, she's very much the bored and horny housewife finding an escape through literature. The book she gives Gawain seems to be a collection of poetry. It features a medieval love poem, the one we hear Gawain read from, called When the Nightingale Sings, that was found in a 14th century anthology known as the Harley Lyrics. It regards a woman who is jaded with previous loves, lamenting her troubles to a new sweetheart that she's hopeful for. Visually, the book is based almost exactly on this one, though, but this isn't the book that contained the Harley Lyrics. Its heart-shape when opened, coupled with the subject matter of the poem that Gawain reads, are a clear indicator of the lady's unhappiness in her marriage and her hope for new love with Gawain. She's essentially signaling to him that she's DTF in as bold a way as courtly manners would allow for. We then see her make a portrait of Gawain using a form of camera obscura. Unlike his previous portrait, which was a representation, a biased retelling, this is an actual depiction of who he is. And gone is the regal pose and air of superiority. Here he is dark and brooding and conflicted. He's troubled, almost as if it's taken a photograph of his soul. He's not the man he sees himself as, or even how others see him. This is a dark reflection of him. It's bringing to the fore all the stains on his soul that he's yet to overcome. That's one of the reasons we see it prominently during the great ending flash-forward sequences. All his worst traits, the Gawain he will become if he chooses cowardice and desire over selfless virtue. That's why it's the lady that takes it, because she represents that desire. And there is another piece of visual significance to the photo, and that is the similarity to the Shroud of Turen't, the sheet of fabric that supposedly covered Christ's body following crucifixion and prior to resurrection, and is supposedly stained in blood with his visage. The half-tone print of Gawain is almost certainly supposed to be reminiscent of that, and that also bears weight in the ending sequence, which we'll look at in more detail when we get there. We see the lady ask Gawain if the bells signify love. They most certainly do, as far as Essel is concerned, but Gawain replies no. Whether that's true or not on his part, either way he's dishonouring Essel, and in turn his covenant. Either he's been coldly leading Essel on, or he's convinced himself that Essel can never be his wife, or he's simply lying so as not to deter the advances of the lady. Really, all roads lead to Rome in this case, with Gawain acting uncaringly and prioritising selfish sexual desire. There's also the subtextual connotation of the bells and Essel and Gawain's monogamy all being representative of Christian ideals and virtue, and the lady being a pagan witch. So while on the face of it, this is her manner of seducing him, there's a deeper background power struggle going on for Gawain's loyalty between the pagan and Christian, or the natural and the modern, depending on how you want to view it. And that's exactly what the film dwells on next, as we get this sexy, creepy monologue from the lady regarding the green. While gathered around the hearth, the Lord starts rambling about the security of a man's home, strong walls and plumb lines, perhaps even goading the lady as to the benefits of contemporary living. The lady clearly takes offense to this and starts this threatening tirade about the color green, which she uses as poetic shorthand for the creeping power of nature. She begins with the question, why is he green, do you think? And this really is the film directly addressing the audience, pushing them to consider the subtext of all the green in the film. As we know, he's green because of his relation or resemblance to the green man and paganistic symbolism. He represents life and death and rebirth and the natural cycle, and really all the things that the film has the lady lay out in this monologue. She says that green is the colour of life, and the connotation is clear, that all living things spring up from and eventually return to the verdant green of nature. She speaks of how we covet the colour for its aesthetic values, but also of the disrespect man shows to nature, of its eradication and mistreatment at human hands. Essentially that we enjoy it as a pretty thing to look at, but don't care for its actual well-being, treating it selfishly and for our own needs. Which is pretty damn clever, because we've got her actual meaning of the land of Camelot being ravaged into modernity, but we've also got a more modern secondary reading of the very real threat of climate change and habitat destruction. As well as that though, it's also exemplary of how Gawain treats people and how both Gawain and the period treat women. She doesn't just see green as representing plant life, but all life. She also brings in the colour red to signal lust and sees green as what lust leaves behind. If red is the passion of sexual intimacy, then green is the bounty of life that springs forth from it. And that ties in very cleanly with what I was discussing before, with these notions of red and white as always being representational of bodily fluids in the natural cycle. And here we see the film acknowledging that long-standing theory and tying it together with the historical and literary connotations of green. She also makes reference to blue during this speech. Now, firstly, this is a knowing nod to Le Morte d'Arthur, which doesn't feature the same Knight of the Green Chapel as we see in the Gawain poem. However, in Le Morte d'Arthur, Gawain and his close associates do have encounters with a red knight, a green knight, and a blue knight. She asks why green, why not blue? Encouraging the viewer to think about all the things that we're discussing right now. Why was it a green knight in the original story and so on? But the director mentioned the costume designer had certain visual illusions in mind when he dressed both the Lord and Lady in blue, and so this allusion to blue seems to be more than just a reference. I think pretty obviously the Lord and Lady are dressed in blue because of its regal connotations. It was a colour primarily worn by nobility, and also there's the connotation of the blue blood of monarchy. To say why green then, why not blue or red, is to pose the question to the viewer. Why is the thing that stuck about this character his link to nature? Not his knightly nobility status as blue would suggest, or his skills and viciousness in combat as red might. It's a cleverly crafted way of guiding the audience towards understanding the subtext of what the knight means and the importance of the natural world to Gawain's story. As her anger becomes more apparent, she begins to portray the green not as victim but as predator, vengeful and unstoppable, eventually and certainly reclaiming everything in its path, taking back and covering everything man has built through soft, eternal pressure. By a certain point, she's really just straight up threatening Gawain, or at least the system of masculine endeavour that he represents, Camelot and the world of progress. She says that all you hold dear will succumb to it, your skin, your bones, your virtue. And think about what's been significant about Gawain so far. His skin, which we see a lot of and is constantly being caressed in one way or another. His bones and the nebulous and effervescent mortality they've come to signify. And of course his virtue, which is essentially the main concern of the film and the story in general. She's telling Gawain that the forces of nature are going to consume everything he holds dear, everything he represents, including the honour and virtue that we know long outlives him. And she's right, on a long enough timeline, everything we've built will return to nature, even the stories we tell each other. Gawain won't have to wait that long, however, because shortly after this, the lady will have all but destroyed his virtue anyway, when she successfully seduces him. It can also be seen as a call for his surrender. If he tricks the Green Knight, his future is all walls and swords and progress, but deep resentment and unfulfillment, leading to a crumbling kingdom and a return to the green. If he accepts the green, if he's honest with the knight and forfeits his life, then he will die and be returned to nature all the quicker, but he will ultimately have lived as a good man. Really, it's not so much asking him to choose as presenting him with the reality that no matter what he chooses, the green will ultimately outlast everyone and claim victory in the end. During this scene, we get quick cuts to Gawain in a ruined building surrounded by ivy, emphasizing this encroachment and threat of the natural to the kingdom man has built and the Christian values that govern it. Not that we need it, but we also get a quick verbal confirmation that the Green Knight is directly representative of the forces of green, in the form of Joel Edgerton asking Gawain what he hopes to gain by facing all of this hue, which is a knowingly comical way of putting things. In fact, Joel Edgerton almost steals the movie for me with this scene alone. This is absolutely my favourite line in the film.
Have you ever seen a hawk kill a horse? It's terrible.
He's very watchable here, and if you haven't seen The King yet, I think he's also excellent in that as a similarly boozy knight. He prods at Gawain, joking that he'll do this one deed and a switch will be flipped and suddenly he will be honourable. I think this definitely goes along with the Green Knight's sense of humour, but also Arthur's worldview of what makes a good man. Really, they all represent the same thing to Gawain, men with wisdom that he is too young and inexperienced to possess. It's a coming-of-age story, and these are his role models, and if on the very surface level the lady is the bored housewife, then on the very surface level the Lord is the disillusioned warrior who knows it takes more than a good story to make an honourable man. We close the scene with the lady flipping over a sort of medieval tarot card, and we see a figure reminiscent of a devil conspiring with a manticore or chimera figure that potentially has the head of the Green Knight. I've seen a few people online suggesting this is Gawain with a fox's head, like we see during the flash forward ending, but it's definitely not. You can see from how foxes are depicted in medieval art and in this film, and then look at depictions of manticores, and it's pretty clear that's what this is. Manticores were associated with fraud and chimeras with shapeshifting in general, so this is really just visual language for the Coven being in cahoots with the Green Knight being someone else in changed visage, and the shape-shifting nature of the ladies on their way to Gawain's chambers in the following scenes. First, Gawain's mother, disguised as the crone, visit, and we see her perform these same hand motions around Gawain's face, again as part of some kind of protection ritual prior to making him a new sash. She seems to display concern for Gawain, probably still uncertain of which path he intends to take and what sort of man he will become. Her motions are protective and nurturing. These hand movements almost look as though she's trying to read his thoughts to get any information she can on what he will choose. And we can presume the Coven stay up late making that sash, because by morning one of them, and probably a different one given the change in haircut, has redisguised herself as the lady and goes with the sash to seduce Gawain. I think the change in the lady's hair here probably signifies that the witch, or the daughter that does all the talking about the green, isn't the same one that's comfortable getting incestuous with Gawain. It's clear from Morgaugh's actions as the crone that she wants Gawain to be seduced, to use the sash, but that shouldn't be construed as her wanting an ill fate for her son. In the original, Gawain doesn't tell the knight of the protection sash, and he comes away successful and righteous. Here the efforts to seduce him are really more to indoctrinate him to their side. Just because she doesn't value the restrictions of chivalric code doesn't mean she doesn't value her son. She most certainly isn't trying to cause his downfall like her sister usually is by this point in the story. Just like Arthur, she wants Gawain to go out and make a name for himself. She just doesn't necessarily buy into the code of ethics that dictate the need for her son to be decapitated, and so she decides to give him a secret weapon. Now I actually think it's more than that Arthur and Morgause both understand both outcomes and trust Gawain to make the right choice. Arthur makes it clear that if Gawain wants to follow him onto the throne, that he must commit great deeds, and Morgause tells him he must not waste this opportunity. Ultimately, I think there's a lot of signals that they've orchestrated this entire thing to provide Gawain with the test he was lacking, but we can't 100% confirm that. What we can say for certain when we look at Morgause's actions as the crone is that she most definitely wants a positive outcome for her son, despite the incestuous and dishonest route she's taking to get there. And speaking of incestuous, that brings us nicely to Gawain receiving a helping hand from the lady in the form of the second sash. Just like in the original story, the lady comes to Gawain's chambers and attempts to seduce him. Gawain tells her it's wrong, as he traditionally does, but that's about as far as he gets in terms of living up to the discipline of OG Gawain. He admits to her he wanted to visit her chambers, which is already breaking his covenant. Everything that comes after is really his lowest point as far as his honor goes. His assertion that it isn't right following this could be a frontrunner for understatement of the millennia. His meaning is that it isn't right because she's married, but there's also Essel to consider, his chivalric covenant, the fact that this is almost certainly his sister in Magic Masquerade, and it's all been voyeuristically overseen by his mother disguised as an old white lady. The lady then asks him if he believes in magic and witchcraft, to which he naturally replies yes, because this seems like a pretty obvious question in the context of this universe. But really it's more veiled code for seeing where his allegiances lie and further seducing him into this world of paganistic desire and away from Christian values. Regimented moralism versus primal earthly desire. The lady then presents Gawain with the identical sash, and rather than giving it to him, has him take it from her. And there's a bit of a double meaning with the sexual act that's important here. If you take, you aren't seduced, you decide willingly. And this actually played a pretty major role in sexual consent all the way up to the Victorian period. Women that were willing were seen as whorish even in marriage. Instead, women must allow themselves to be taken, which is a pretty minor and weird distinction, but one that's important here. Gawain isn't falling victim to seduction. He's taking the sash, taking the sexual encounter, rather than having it thrust upon him. So we've already discussed what the sash traditionally represents. At first it's a symbol of Gawain's dishonesty, then it becomes a symbol of the opposite, of his truthfulness and honour when the knights realise how far he was willing to go. Here we see any hope of that narrative destroyed by Gawain ejaculating on the sash. It's an explicit visual metaphor for his failure to uphold his covenant of knightly virtue, physical evidence of his misplaced desire spilling onto a symbol that is traditionally understood to be a celebration of his impeccable honour and unflinching resolve to always do the right thing. There is something else the sash signifies though. At the start of the original poem, Gawain is defined not by the sash, but by his Pentangle symbol, a distinctly male symbol. It's emblazoned on his armaments and is the logo for his code of military conduct. By the end, he is defined by a beautiful silk sash, a decidedly feminine object. There's a definite transition of the character from masculine certainty to someone who understands the more feminine traits that Gawain displays during his tests of heart and mind. It's essentially the arc Gawain takes on his way to becoming this long-term hero of the chivalric romance. Think of it as proto-metrosexual. And that's interesting because once Gawain does give in to temptation, the lady's reaction is "you're no knight," which can be read a lot of ways, but absolutely one way it should be understood is "you're no man." There's definitely a mocking tone to "you're no knight," just like Essel made fun of his impotence earlier. His knighthood is directly related to his manhood, and ashamedly ejaculating on himself and a supposed symbol of knightly virtue isn't exactly apex chivalry. There's also perhaps the more direct sexual mocking. Gawain's main problem throughout is selfish and misplaced desire, and this is a pretty sexually selfish performance on his part given her efforts at seduction that also is misplaced in where it lands. But if the tone is slightly mocking, it's also mostly confirming. For me at least, it's more reassuring than it is spiteful. He's being manipulated into falling into temptation so that he will take the protection of the sash, and so her saying "you're no knight" primarily is her saying, see, you've broken your covenant, you've given in to desire, you're no knight and it's fine, just do what you need to do to look after yourself, so that he will make the right decision as they see it. You're no knight, you're one of us, one of the green. During the encounter, the lady makes Gawain repeatedly say the words in fact, indicating that he wants the sash. Now given the sexual context of the situation, I want it again obviously has clear double meaning. It's purposefully conflating the seduction and his abandonment of his knightly principles by making it referential of both the sexual act and the item of protection, but both have the same outcome: the failure to uphold Gawain's covenant and his falling further into dishonesty and selfish desire. Even deeper than that, you can see the "it" Gawain wants as the future where he rules Camelot, all of his selfish hopes for future recognition and kingdom. And this is why Gawain's mother is standing by to watch. She needs to see this perversion, this manipulation of Gawain firsthand, so that she can know in her heart that he's going to make the right choice as she sees it. That's why she has the lady force Gawain to verbally confirm that he wants the world of selfish desire, that he wants to take the sash and will use it. And I think we see this uncertainty from her because of what she sees when she sort of reads Gawain's mind with these hand motions. I think when she did this back in Camelot, she saw a selfish and impetuous boy that would gladly take the advantage. What she saw in the Lord's castle was perhaps something different, confusion. He did the right thing with Winifred, he's persevered through scavenger attacks, and he still seems set on keeping his date at the chapel despite no longer having the sash. Perhaps she saw the inklings of a good man, a good knight, and she knows where that will lead. And fearful that she may lose her son, I think she steps up her efforts here, orders one of her coven to seduce him back into temptation and provide him with another sash. That's why she needs to hear that he wants it, and that's why she's watching her son get a handjob. Interestingly enough though, the weirdness of this may be the moment that pushes him over the edge into making the honourable decision. He's clearly a little ashamed post-climax, but he's not fleeing the manor. It's this micromanagement by his mother of needing to see it done that pushes him over the edge. It's essentially parental overbearingness, and that's interesting because this is a coming-of-age story about the man he will become, and it's the overbearing nature of his mother that forces him to go out and become one. We see this play out with the axe as he runs away too. The axe is a symbol of his quest and the honour of his word, and while he momentarily forgets it, he comes back and grabs it with renewed vigour. He's pushed over the edge with shame in his actions, but at that moment he decides he's done with shame and guilt and sets out to complete his quest like a good knight. And maybe that was Morgause's intent all along. Maybe she wanted to push him towards that ending too, to become the Gawain of legend despite the sacrifice. It's the knife edge of uncertainty that the film dances along. After Gawain flees the castle, he is quickly chased down by the Lord, and at first this is built to be threatening, but very quickly we see it's rooted in seduction and temptation as well. He asks Gawain if there's anything he has to give him, and when Gawain refuses, he says there is something, and that he thinks he can take it from Gawain. Again, that reference to being taken, and the shifting of Gawain from masculine to feminine, now he's the one being taken. So obviously on the surface level, he knows what Gawain and his wife have been up to, and the Lord is referring to their game and the kiss that's now owed to him. But there's something more than that. He sees potential homosexual desire in Gawain, and I think I can take it from you means he thinks he can pull that desire out. And Gawain's reaction is interesting to say the least. They share quite a tender kiss, definitely not a kiss of friendship, and Gawain gets very tearful and asks for the Lord to unhand him, which again is pretty feminine, pretty damsel-like language. And I think he's crying because ultimately the Lord is right. I don't think Gawain is gay or that he'd given the subject any thought up until that point. But in this moment he realizes there may be something there, something he knows he has to ignore, to kill in order to go face his quest, to find virtue and rid himself of the shame he feels for his selfish behaviour. Really, the moment before with the lady is his lowest moment, the moment he decides he needs to be a good man. This is his first test following that, and so he cries because he realises he has to leave selfish desire behind and look instead to duty and potentially his death. These two moments are his coming of age, with his actions in the chapel representing the later in life conquest over the fear of death and acceptance of mortality. I'm not saying he doesn't feel something quite strongly here, he clearly does, but this is about his decision to finally say no to temptation. Now we know what's really going on. The Lord is further part of the plan to seduce Gawain, so presumably he wants the same thing as the rest of the coven, seduce and manipulate Gawain to their side in order to better control his actions. However, there is a pretty key difference between the two that I think points to the deeper test at work here. As we've covered, the Lord is obsessed with strong walls and the security of a warm hearth. He's also an avid hunter. He intends to hunt every day in the run-up to Christmas. He wears the skins of animals he's hunted and takes great delight in observing the viciousness of the natural world. And the lady, Morgause, the whole coven are in opposition to this. They are on the side of green, of nature. So it's not just a test based on desire, it's a test of where Gawain's loyalties lie as well. Does he still desire masculine progress, swords and castles and hunting, or does he want the feminine, natural world that is ever moving to reclaim it? And the Lord's parting words seem to confirm a lot of this. First, the Lord reasserts that they won't be here should Gawain return, which is deliberately vague as the rest of the film, but essentially confirms their illusory nature. More importantly though, is what he says when he releases the fox. As we've covered, the fox is representative of Gawain. The fox being released here is a metaphor for his escape from the castle. As he releases it, he says, "I suppose we should leave him to nature, which is pretty clear doublespeak for the Lord's recognition of Gawain's decision to choose the natural over the modern. It's quite literally what he's doing by leaving Gawain to go face his enemy at the Green Chapel, the site of nature's reclamation. However, very shortly after, we see this get flipped on its head somewhat when the fox starts speaking. And I mentioned this at the start, this voice is the voice of the narrator, cameoed by the director and left uncredited. So there's the big question here of who exactly is this fox, and accompanying raspy demon voice. Now, I've said the fox has always been representative of Gawain. It's most certainly never spoken before in any rendition I'm aware of. I think it's still true that it's representative of Gawain, but it's most certainly not actually him. The fox symbol is there because of the cunning and guile Gawain needs to demonstrate. These are the traits that make the metaphor work. So building from this, most people online seem to have read the fox as Gawain's fears, and I think that's half true. If it wasn't for the fact that this voice is also the narrator, I would have thought the same thing. It's a symbol of all his anxieties and defenses and fears that have carried him through life to this point, and now he's telling them that he doesn't need them anymore as he prepares to face his death honestly. This scene certainly works like that and makes sense in that context if you ignore the fact that he's still absolutely terrified at the chapel. I've seen a couple of articles suggest that the fox is an element of Morgause's magic. This is absolutely not true. The fox says outright that it's not witchcraft, and when you have these creepy, inexplicably omniscient, speaking in riddles characters, the one thing you should know is they're not lying. It's a tool to make you excited to hear mysterious snippets of exposition, and it should be pretty clear that if this fox is saying it isn't witchcraft, then it isn't witchcraft. Really, it does tell us what it is. It says that it and the Green Knight are of the same wild. So I think the fox is essentially not a demonic manifestation, but certainly not a kind one, of a kind of spirit of the wild. If the Green Knight is representative of the power of nature, then the fox is the survival, the voice that has no judgment of cowardice or care for man's notions of honor, the predator and the prey that sees malice as an inescapable aspect of life. It thought it recognized a kindred spirit in Gawain, someone that would do what he needed to survive. When he realizes Gawain's attempt to accept death, he doesn't care so much as make fun of him. He goads him into taking off the sash. So again, definitely not the work of the coven. And he also tells him he wouldn't judge him for not fulfilling the terms. So it isn't any party or motivation we've really heard from so far. It's something more cold and indifferent, something rasping and primordial that doesn't see any weight in human constructions like honor. It's testing him like everyone and everything else is, seeing if his spirit can be broken, but unlike everyone else, it doesn't seem to care about the outcome. I guess that my way of putting it in my head is that the Green Knight is an agent of the green, a soldier for it, but the fox, the narrator, is the voice of it, the mind of it. And then it makes sense that this fox, let's say nature itself as a sort of primordial concept, is the narrator, because it has this timeless quality that sees kings rise and fall. It's the only character present at the time that's still around to tell us the story of Garwin, not the story we've built up around him. Again, there's this kind of omniscient truth-telling to the fox and narrator, and that makes sense if that being is essentially nature, the ever-encroaching green. And that has some serious ramifications for our theory on Gawain choosing nature over modernity, because the truth is, he doesn't. Right after he rejects the Lord, he also rejects the fox. And this is the essential truth of the character, why he's so conflicted. Because unlike almost anyone else in the Arthurian mythos, Gawain is of both worlds, the natural and the contemporary, the divine and the flawed, the masculine and the feminine. He is a character of duality and binary oppositions. Starting from his birth between a knight and a witch, we see it ever present in the film. He has duty to Camelot and his king, but his family is another story entirely. The Green Knight name itself is hinting at this duality, green and knight, same with the Green Chapel. The whole story is a balancing act between paganistic naturalism and Christian values. The Green Knight carries an axe in one hand and a holly bow in the other, and again it's all about balancing these two ideals. Gawain's two items are a green sash imbued by pagan witchcraft and a shield with the chivalric covenant on one side and the Virgin Mary on the other. And so again, the same duality is playing out. And just like in the original mythos, we see Gawain choose his own path. He's not entirely of either world, so he rejects the Lord, he rejects the fox, and eventually he'll reject the sash too. All of it in the context of instead becoming the man he needs to be, and so we can see how that again feeds into the notion of this as a coming-of-age story. We see the masculine pentagram of Christian chivalry replaced with the feminine pagan sash of witchcraft, but as we do, we also see Gawain become a knight, essentially becoming a man. So there's never really a point where he's not of both worlds. In fact, it's these dualities that come to define him. From here, we see Gawain making his final leg of the journey to the chapel, and we see some beautiful shots of nature reclaiming all of this decaying Christian imagery and architecture. It's clear that Gawain is here intending to fulfill his duty, but he is terrified of the outcome still. Even this close to the end, he's still not ready to be a knight, not ready to willingly accept his fate. Gawain is early to the chapel, and the Green Knight is yet to wake, so he waits patiently, staring into the Green Knight's face. And And while he does so, we get some extremely blink and you'll miss it effects over the Green Knight's face that are crucially important. In quick succession, we see various character faces mapped over the Green Knight. In order, they are the Lord, Arthur, Essel, or more likely the Lady, Morgause, and then finally Gawain himself. While it does cycle all of these characters, it's Arthur and Morgause that seem to stand out most clearly. The Green Knight is someone you know. Now, I think primarily Gawain is softly hallucinating the face of his mentors and loved ones in the shadows of the chapel's foliage, thinking about the push and pull of the opposing sides and what they want from the decision he's about to make, seeing reflections of himself and those around him in the knight's ghoulish visage. And sure, you can and should absolutely see it like that. In the director's own words, we see Gawain's face last because all of these characters and encounters have all been leading up to the one choice he is about to make, his pivotal moment. But there is also a connection with all those characters and the shapeshifting magic of the knight. Morgause and the Lady are both shown to be shapeshifting, the Lord almost certainly is too. Leaving out Gawain, Arthur is the only character that appears here that ostensibly isn't connected to these illusions. It seems odd that Arthur would feature here unless he is involved somehow, and I think literally projecting their faces onto the Green Knight, especially given that we know Morgause, the Coven, and the Lord all have a form of connection or control over him, it's saying more than Gawain is just worried what they'll think or mirroring between characters. He's seeing through the fraying edges of the illusion and seeing a different face in the mirror staring back, the shadows of the conspirators behind the magic. Christmas Day rolls around, and just like at the start, we have this born-again Christ metaphor with the new Gawain, the Gawain of legend being reborn on Christmas Day. The Green Knight wakes up and the beheading game commences. There are some differences to how this goes from in the original. Gawain flinches on the first strike in both, but in the original he keeps steady from there. As we know here, we see Gawain enter this extended flash-forward sequence that begins with him fleeing the knight and the chapel and returning to Camelot a fraud. Before he does, we see him ask the knight, "Is this really all there is?" And the knight replies with, "What else ought there be?" And this really is the moment where Gawain is trying to accept death, trying to understand his mortality. He had expected something more, there to be some trick to the game, some way out, something other than the cold reality of death. Perhaps spiritual, perhaps moral. It's the absence of those, the confusing bluntness of it all that he can't accept. The Green Knight's response is oddly practical, given that he's a walking tree monster, but that juxtaposition is intended. His blank confusion, as he says, "What else ought there be?" isn't a dismissal of the divine, it's the understanding that the divine is all around us. He looks around and almost signals as if he's saying, "Is this not enough?" Gawain wants to find greatness and redemption, but now he knows that if he wants them, he must face certain death. He'd hoped for the divine in his future, hoped for greatness, and here the knight is telling him that it's the greatness every day, the divine that surrounds us in nature that we must live for. Really, that's what this ending is saying. Don't live in fear or greed or lust for a potential future, because it almost certainly doesn't exist. If magic or the divine exists, then they're in the world we see every day. So live for now and do good things. Honor your word and treat others as you would wish to be treated, and so on. This is all summed up very tightly in this exchange. In the first line, we see Gawain's horror when he realizes how empty his conclusion will be, how empty this journey is. But the knight's reply is affirming. He doesn't try to comfort Gawain, but the subtext of his answer is clear. What more than this do we need? What more than this should there be? And Gawain's mind tries to answer that question. It skips forward and imagines a life where he does strive for the wrong things, where he allows his life to be ruled by his fear and his cowardice, one where he becomes king rather than the Gawain of legend. We see his ill treatment of Essel and his marrying of a woman due to her station. We see his kingdom slowly collapsing around him as more and more people leave his side. It's all castles and thrones and Christian imagery with none of the natural left. We see his selfish decision-making cost his son his life, and eventually we see his family abandon him until just his mother is by his side. It's worth noting that the daughter that we see here is not the same actress as the one during the end credit sequence. We also see him staring into the painting of the fox with his head, visual allusion to the fact that in this future he has allowed his fear and cunning to rule him. Finally, all alone, we see him pull the sash from himself like he's yanking out his intestines, pulling away the magic that has kept him alive, that he could have shared with his son, and finally accepting his end as an abandoned old man. When he does so, his head falls cleanly off his shoulders, reflecting the fate that he should have met. It's all Gawain's processing of where his selfish decision-making will lead him, and him choosing to be a better man than the one he would be if he ran away. During this sequence, there's a deliberate focus put on the photograph taken by the lady, which hangs behind Gawain's throne. Now yes, as we've covered, this is symbolic of his fears, his doubts, his shadow self, you might say. But I also mentioned that it was reminiscent of the Turen't shroud, the blanket that covered Christ's bleeding body. And that is very purposeful because this whole ending sequence is a clear tribute to Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. In that film, Christ decides not to die on the cross, and we see a lengthy section of movie where he lives a life beyond that, until eventually he finds himself besieged in Jerusalem in a very similar predicament to Gawain here. And eventually we get this flashback to the crucifixion, and Christ realizes that he has to die for man's sins and peace on earth. And really, this is what all of the Christ metaphor, Christ is born and so on, with Gawain in this movie has been leading up to, and it's a very clear synthesis of motifs and outside influences. It's these two moments that come to define who each character will be. Jesus realizes that he can't just live as a good man, he needs to accept the responsibility to die as a great one. Gawain, on the other hand, realizes that he won't ever live as a great man and needs to allow himself to die a good one. And that's exactly what he does. We cut back to the chapel and Gawain on his knees. He removes the sash and says to the Green Knight, "There, now I'm ready." And not just ready to accept death or to become a man or to live and die honorably, but also finally ready to be a knight, something he spent the whole film saying he's not, and right at the start said he wasn't ready for. That one line ties up all of those motifs of what he needs to be ready for very neatly. This clearly has a profound effect on the Green Knight, who for the first time stops just trying to swing the axe and leans down to meet Gawain's gaze. We get this very clear mirroring of Arthur touching Gawain's face, and then the knight refers to him as "my brave knight." The only person who can knight Gawain is Arthur, as we see him doing in the flash forward, and it's clear that the knight is speaking to him with the same nurturing care that Arthur shows for him. Also, that he says "my knight." Gawain is one of Arthur's knights if he's one of anyone's. For me at least, I think there's definitely a sub-narrative here where Arthur is involved in pulling the strings. I think there's too much evidence for it to be accidental or referential of something else. Like everything else though, it's kept deliberately abstract, so all possibilities can be true. The knight gives Gawain a knowing smile and says, "Off with your head." And I don't think there's any malice in it. It's either the smile of "it's just a game" or a smile of comfort, depending on how you read this final scene. And the subject of Gawain's decapitation is even more purposefully ambiguous than the rest of the movie, as it just cuts straight out to a title. Naturally, it's encouraging you to fill in your own ending, and I think was made more vague than it perhaps was in the original edit pre-COVID delays. The director David Lowery has said that he wanted the end to feel like you're rooting for Gawain's decapitation, that his acceptance of death and his actual death should be sought by the audience after everything he's done to cheat it. So on a meta sense, I think it's pretty clear that the director's original intention was to have Gawain decapitated, or at least make it clear that's what probably happens. For the most part, that's the ending I ascribe to. There's just too much of this film that's pushing towards Gawain's death. But as with so many things before it in this film, looking at it in one way, no matter what way, is the only wrong answer. It doesn't want to tell a story of definites. It's dancing around different constructions and adaptations and renditions, and it doesn't like to hold itself to one thing. It focuses in on what's important, the man Gawain became, the decision he made and why he made it. Gawain didn't get to know if he was going to be spared or not. If he knew the outcome, there would be no bravery or faith required. There certainly wouldn't be any honor. You're as blind as he is here, because the message of the film really is to live well and without fear of what happens next. If it told you, if the outcome was, and then everything was okay and the knight told him it was just a game, then you aren't being brave. You know the sacrifice doesn't require bravery, and ultimately that's what the film is asking you. Will you live well now, truthfully and honorably, or will you choose the other path? Just like Gawain, you don't get to know how it ends. And because this film really doesn't want to be pinned down, despite all the relative certainty that Gawain probably does get beheaded, we get a post-credit scene, another contradiction in Gawain's narrative in the form of a little girl, presumably Gawain's daughter, but not the daughter we see in the flash forward, suggesting this is a girl he's had with Essel. She's playing with the crown of Camelot, which has been left on the floor, and there's a few things going on here. Firstly, this suggests a happier future where Gawain isn't beheaded and becomes king. Again, multiple readings of the same legend, and one here that allows for a positive outcome for the honest Gawain. Maybe this takes place in a linear structure from the end and he wasn't killed. Alternatively, this could be another Gawain or another flash forward. It's not really important. The crown on the floor suggests Gawain has found more important things than station and recognition, presumably family, given the happy tableau we see with the child. I think it also definitely speaks to the future of women, one where women can become a leader too, rather than being restricted to the damsel or the seductress. The film has been consistently showing women to be far more capable than the mythos gives them credit for, and rather than concerning itself with Gawain, this seems to be pointing towards that there's something more positive waiting for the women in the future of Camelot. And that's everything for this video, guys. Thank you so much if you stuck with me this whole time. I really hope I've been able to shed some light on the movie. A lot of you have asked me what I thought and voiced your criticisms to me about it. I completely hear you on that. Honestly, I think there's a lot of room to be disappointed, depending on what you were expecting. At the same time, though, for me, it really is a phenomenally good film, very much in the same way the second Blade Runner was, in that I almost can't believe we got this film at this budget. I'm very grateful that A24 are making these kind of movies that are really odd and exciting, and obviously that's going to be divisive and disappointing for a lot of people. But I think the longer you spend with this film, the more it starts to open up to you and reveal a lot of carefully crafted secrets and further references and depth that it has to offer. That's what I've really been aiming to get across in this video, and I'm super excited to hear what you all have to say. I'll have a lot more videos coming soon. This has been around 2 weeks work. The script was just over 30,000 words and I rambled a lot over that when I remembered stuff, so It's taken a while, but there'll be a lot of shorter videos coming frequently over the next few weeks. Thanks so much again for watching, guys. Peace.